Hey guys, today I have something a little different, which is a look at Havoc Demon Hunters, the newly added melee DPS in Legion. Since I've already been doing a bit of work covering them with an overview doc, which you can check in the comments, I thought it was high time to actually put a balanced look at the spec together on video now it seems to have settled down. Similar to my videos on enhancement, I'll be looking at the base abilities, then the talents, and finally how the artifact impacts gameplay currently. Obviously, everything with the class is very much a work in progress, it seems, and some things I talk about here may already be outdated by the time you watch the video, so please bear that in mind, since the spec has already gone through a number of iterations and changes over the course of the alpha, and as such, some things I say may be a little bit coloured by that. So here in this video, I'll be going through the basic abilities available to the Demon Hunter. First we'll look quickly at the core, then the extra rotational damage tools, the mobility and defense, the mastery, and finally a segment on just metamorphosis itself. In subsequent videos, as with enhancement, I'll look at the talents, and then a separate video on the artifact and legendaries, and hopefully there'll be a full set for everything, so you can check everything that you want to know out about the class. The core of the spec then revolves predominantly around the two primary spells you can learn at the very start of the leveling experience, those being Demon's Bite and Chaos Strike. These have a symbiotic build-spend relationship in which the former deals quite poor physical damage with an RNG resource gain aspect, and the latter gives you very high chaos damage, scaling with your mastery, and also causing crits to refund the fury cost to cast. Generally, this means the base gameplay is very simple. You build and then you spend, and while other spells require you to manage that expenditure a little bit more, the standard in and out for your resource will mostly be focused on these two spells. The overly simplistic nature then of that relationship isn't fantastic on its own, I have to say, and is a common talking point from other sources when you look around on YouTube. More importantly, however, the RNG nature of the amount of fury gained through Demon's Bite casts, compounded by the RNG of critting for free Chaos Strikes, gives the flow of gameplay a real stop-start kind of feel to it, which can be quite jarring. Talents I'll discuss later do a good job of smoothing some of those problems out and amplifying aspects of the kit that I'm about to move on to now that are severely lacking on their own. There's then a series of extraneous tools available that are mostly shackled by cooldowns with a small extra resource cost attached. First of those is I-Beam, which is a really strong, big impact, highly visual tool dealing solid damage in both single and multi-target. Though when AoE begins to really stack up and you can position correctly, this is as strong, if not stronger, than Bladestorm for a burst AoE cooldown purpose. It also only has a 45-second cooldown with a 50 fury cost, so is relatively easy to plan around and make use of. Chaos Nova is a 1 minute cooldown AoE stun for 5 seconds with a low 30 fury cost and a small AoE chaos damage hit around it when used. This spell mostly serves its purpose when linked with other talents for pure DPS, but as it's a point-blank, long-duration stun, I can still see it finding some pretty solid uses in most content, as generally they're always quite useful. Next is Throwglaive, which is mostly just a filler when out of range that deals a fairly solid percent of weapon damage with a short 12-second cooldown. Most of its value, though, is tied into a certain talent I'll discuss later in another video, so it's mostly just relegated to a flavor ability without that, or a small cleave tool prior to artifact perks buffing that aspect of the spell. Finally, in these tools is Blade Dance. This spell has gone through more iterations than your average PTR patch and is still arguably in a really weird place. It seems to slowly but surely be eking its way into the rotational AoE spell for Havoc, but it's got a little bit of time to go still to get there. It costs slightly more than a standard Chaos Strike at 50, so it's the same as I-Beam, but with no reset mechanic, and only deals physical damage, so it doesn't scale with your mastery, and it has a baseline 10-second cooldown with a 100% dodge aspect tacked on for flavour, lasting for 1 second. This cooldown does scale with haste, but it's not really enough to make it readily available if you're in a high AoE situation. Again, some talents affect this choice, but as it stands now, it's your only reliable, short cooldown AoE available, given that I-Beam is more of a mid-range level cooldown that's only available every so often. Whilst it's already had a lot of attention so far, I still think it's one of the most important things to get right and hit its sweet spot, but it's getting there after a pretty long road. Next, mobility, which at the baseline is split between two separate abilities, those being Fell Rush and Vengeful Retreat, as were revealed way back at Gamescom last year. Fell Rush operates in a similar way to Roll, though it has the benefit of a lower 10-second cooldown, a damage aspect, and more instantaneous repositioning, but it can only push you forward. Given it comes with charges and is on such a low cooldown, then it is a great tool and has a big impact on how dynamic your presence is in the fight and on a battlefield. Second, Vengeful Retreat comes with a longer cooldown, again which can be altered by talents, and is a direct leap backwards, think disengage but a little bit shorter and a bit higher, with a small damage and slow component. It can couple very well with Fell Rush to get back in after leaping back, and it gives a lot of instant response movement in bad situations, which emphasises the active movement aspect of the class, which is to avoid instead of tank and survive. Lastly, Defense. Looking on the general tools, Demon Hunters at the base only have Blur. This is a flat 35% DR on a 1 minute cooldown for 10 seconds, which also gives a token 50% dodge, much like the really old Rogue Evasion or the dodge mechanic from Warcraft 3 for any Demon Hunters out there remembering that. Given how frequently it's available and how significant the DR is at its base, it is a great, solid baseline defensive tool, which can also be augmented further with talents for various different situations, and when you add in the mobility aspect to sync with it, you're getting a pretty robust package for self-preservation and uptime tools in raids and dungeons and in general PvE. A quick segue then, after movement, to just go through the mastery for Havoc, being Demonic Presence. This grants a flat % damage increase to all chaos damage dealt by you, being your Chaos Strike, your I-Beam baseline, and a couple of other talented tools, and your base movement speed. This adds an interesting mechanic then to the stat, since when you invest points in it, you're effectively getting the movement speed there completely for free, adding to your already quite good mobility kit. Finally then, I'm going to be going through Metamorphosis both as an ability and the tools it grants whilst active. At its base, Metamorphosis comes with a lengthy 5-minute cooldown, and when activated, it stuns all targets around you and deals a small 200% AP chaos damage nuke in the area. For the next 30 seconds after, your Chaos Strike becomes Annihilation, which is a slightly stronger but completely AoE version of the spell, which by extension increases the chances for the Fury refund, which is gladly welcomed and has a massive effect on AoE. Blade Dance also switches to Death Sweep, dealing double the amount of damage of a regular Blade Dance on the same cooldown, which, given that you only go into Metamorphosis briefly or with the demonic talent in small windows, this is really strong for a really quick bursty AoE segment on a boss. Okay, so the most important thing then, after all of that explanation of how the spells work, is what my general opinion really is on how the game plays and the overview of whether or not the spec is actually fun. So there are a few big points that I'd like to get across. First is that the base rotation itself is quite spammy and it is a little bit boring when there's no spice added by the talents. You do press the same button over and over again, and because the resource is quite RNG in nature, based on just the amount that you gain, which is a variable, and whether or not you crit to receive the Fury back, can sometimes overwhelm you if you aren't prepared for it at the right time. There is also the occasional frustration of not critting when you really needed it and you know you needed it, or vice versa when you're flooded with resource and you want to get rid of it and then you crit and then you can't, you overcap and then you are stuck with wasted fury that you could have used elsewhere when you didn't want to. There's a few other minor complaints such as I-Beam rooting you in place, which could be a possible issue. It was a big issue for Fists of Fury, for Windwalkers for a really long time, and that kind of thing. Despite how mobile you are, especially in fact how mobile you are, could be a problem when you are locked into one place so you can't use those tools to escape, especially when your defensives are quite active. Blade Dance is also simply not fulfilling a defined role yet. It does need to have the rules set in place for what the spell is supposed to do. Too many times I see people who are pulling at both arms, asking for it to be single target that can also be used in AoE or vice versa. The spell just simply needs to have the tooth pulled out and said that it is going to be this or that. Until that happens, the spell is not going to be appealing and it's not really going to be used because of how good Chaos Strike is on its own. That leads also into the fact that the spec simply does need a low cooldown baseline AoE to keep using in between those I-Beam casts. If you don't have anything to use in AoE, you're simply relegated to pressing Chaos Strike, which either forces you into taking Chaos Cleave, which doesn't scale past 2 mobs, or unfortunately just leaves you in your single target rotation, which is not appealing either, as we've all seen with other classes that have had that single target niche, especially in WoD. That kind of covers then everything I have to say about the baseline Demon Hunter kit. Unlike my other overview series, I'm going to look again at how the spec plays elsewhere in the series with the different layers of the class added on, such as talents and artifacts, because of how profound of an effect they have on how enjoyable the spec is to play. One big thing I would like to say though, before I sign off, is that it really isn't as bad as has been portrayed initially in the first passes. The spec has moved on leaps and bounds from the first few weeks when the early videos came out, and it's in a much more rounded spot now. Since I've only talked about the baseline, there are obvious gaps here that are improved on elsewhere, so I'd say that the devs at the moment are very invested in bringing the spec to life properly. There is even a good amount of complexity found within the talents, which is important, as I have heard a lot of places that have brushed the spec off as overly simple or basic or without much depth, which really just isn't true anymore. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this quick first look at Havoc, and I'll be following up with the talents soon, so if you want to see more, hit subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.